biography, the new biography BB wrote. And I
Please
sent
don't.
it to her, and she's delighted to have it. It's a big, heavy book, and I just commentary. That doesn't mean anything except that the other side of my family is on a completely different wavelength than I am.
They live on the frozen tundra in Minnesota. I mean,
Right. What can you expect, huh?
No. But it'll be an interesting trip because you'll hear all sides.
Yes.
That's the goal. I mean, you will hear all sides. Some more conservative, some more liberal, Palestinian, Israeli, religious, secular. I've worked really hard to make sure that you're going to hear more sides than you ever thought existed.
Oh.
So, all right. So why don't we get started? And as other people join us, so be it. What I want to do is I'm going to take you on a crash course of like 3,000 years of history. Just so you have some context and understand what the present situation is. And this, if you've gotten the short history of the Jewish people, and if you read that, I'm just going to highlight some of the stuff that's in that book. If you haven't gotten it, and you're really interested in sort of the history of the Jewish people in Israel, get it. It's something you can get within a couple days on Amazon. I think I had sent it out before that, and there was another book by Yoshi Klein Halevi, which follows the paratroop unit that liberated the old city during the '67 war. But I'm recording this, so I'm going to send this out to everybody so that folks who weren't able to join us will have it. And I'll also make sure that I list those two books if you feel like doing a deep dive before you get on the plane. So what we have, we sort of know the Jewish history from the Bible, but there's other sources that we recognize, the Jewish people. There is what is known as a stele, which is a archaeological find that during one of the pharaohs conquering that region, talks about how he defeated all these different tribes, and Israel was one of them. And this predates Christ. It demonstrates that there was a people of Israel as an outside the biblical source. So we know that a tribe of people living in this region were known as the Israelites. At the same time, now the Israelites were probably more hill people. Their strongholds are usually found in the hills of what we would now look at as the West Bank. And so while the Israelites were the hill people, the coastlands were what was called Philistia. And that was a term that predates the Romans. Philistia is the name of the land that was basically described as the land of the Philistines. The Philistines were seafaring people that we believe were part of sort of like that same seafaring group that at a point in time put the Egyptian empire under threat. They were kind of advanced compared to the Egyptians. They were extremely well organized. We believe that they may have been the ones that brought the first chariots to Egypt. And so they resided along the coastlands. Interestingly enough, Gaza was known as Gaza back then. It's a historic land, the Gaza region, and that's where the Philistines were based out of. So you had these two ancient peoples, the Philistines and the Israelites, who existed side by side. We know from biblical narrative that they frequently came into conflict, fighting over a very small region of the land. That was important in the sense that it was a major trade route. It was a trade route that bridged what we would say is, modern Iraq and Iran, uh, people who were trading from the east who wanted to get to the Egyptian empire. So you would traverse the land of what we now call Israel and Palestine to get from one place to the other. So it was a pivotal region. The trade routes to get through the mountains, that would be by the mountains of, say, Mount Carmel, which is where Haifa is, going over the Golan, and up through Damascus, through North Syria, and then down the Fertile Crescent, was critical. And so it's one of the reasons why the land is frequently under conflict. Now, the biblical narratives speak about the conflict more of a religious side, but much of this conflict was economic. And obviously religions go with it because religions go with people. And so it becomes a religious battle, but it was mostly for economics. Over time, the Israelite community it doesn't overwhelm, but has a greater prominence on the land than the Philistines do. Whether through the efforts of, say, David and Solomon, who weren't the mighty kings that we think of, that the Bible tells us about, but were mighty chieftains, but were very successful in their conflicts with the surrounding people. But whatever, by the time we get to David and Solomon and then further kings, the Philistines still exist, but they're not really a power. Now, you had the northern kingdom of Israel that existed until the 7th century. And then you have the southern kingdom of Judah that exists until it goes into exile in the 6th century. And then you have the overlays. You have the Babylonian conquest, the Persian conquest. Alexander the Great conquers then the Persian Empire, creates, Alexander's empire. When that falls apart, upon Alexander's death, you have the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire, which would be Egypt, and then what we'd know as Israel, Palestine, and some of Jordan, as well as Syria, actually. So during all these times, it's external powers who are in charge. Okay. And then finally, you have the coming of the Romans. The Romans are actually invited in by certain groups within the Jewish community to try and bring peace, thinking that that would lead to Israel becoming independent again. Of course, it never happened. So by the time you get the Romans, you have lands that, for the most part, had been under control for 3 or 4 centuries by external powers. Israel as a political entity doesn't exist. Judah as a political entity really doesn't exist. And now that they do exist, they exist underneath as a vassal state, and controlled by Rome. The Jewish people never go quietly with this sort of scenario. As a people, they always assumed that God was with them and that they should be able to govern themselves. They should be independent. And so they frequently revolt against the Romans. There's frequent comings of Messiah, people who claim to be a Messiah. Eventually, we know about the destruction of the temple in 70, which, when we go and visit Masada, we'll hear more about that, revolt and what happens. But then the major revolt that occurs is in 130, and that's the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Simon Bar Kokhba, Bar Kokhba meaning the star, is anointed as the Messiah by one of the Jewish leaders of that time. At the beginning, the rebellion is successful, so much so that it raises the ire of the Romans, who decide once and for all, we need to be rid of the Jewish people. And so the first Holocaust really occurs in response to the Bar Kokhba rebellion. It's said that from the road of Jerusalem that led to Caesarea, which was where the Roman governor would reside, that there was a crucifix set up every few feet, and on that crucifix was a Jew. The entire city of Jerusalem was destroyed. The people were kicked out, and as the ultimate insult to the Jewish people, the Romans renamed the land Palestina, Palestine. They choose that name because that's the ancient enemy of the Israelites, the Philistines. So the name Palestine comes from the Romans, and it's an insult. It really doesn't recognize that there was a quote unquote Palestinian people. Palestinians might have descended from the Philistines, but that's highly unlikely. Just because for a large period of time the region is nomadic, and you have people coming and going, groups from other places settling in the territories, etc. Now, while the Romans tried to kick the Jews out, and for the most part they succeeded, there still was a Jewish presence in the land from that time until this time. Originally, it was a small pocket that kind of resettles in, what's the name? Yavna, where the beginning of the rabbinic tradition begins. There was also people fled to the Galilee, which was less controlled than it was in Jerusalem. So Jews settled in the Galilee. Some Jews remained in the Jerusalem area. And oh, by the way, Jerusalem gets renamed Aeola Capitolina, which is a recognition of the sun worship, I believe. And again, it's a Roman name. So the Romans tried to destroy every heritage of the Jewish people that there is. They don't succeed, but they tried. So that's the status, sort of like in the ancient times. Now, over a period of time, as the Roman Empire sort of surges and then wanes, Jews slowly resettle back in the area. So that by the time Constantine is the new emperor, there's a pretty sizable Jewish presence back in Jerusalem and the environs. The Philistines, we don't hear much about the Philistines, but we do know that the region is now overwhelmingly referred to as Palestine. And again, that's inherited from the Romans, and now Constantine sort of continues it. It sort of means more of a geographic governmental entity, and Palestine will frequently be the names of the different powers that will govern the lands. Up into even the Ottoman Empire, Palestine was seen as the area of Israel, Jordan, and southern Syria, and it was governed out of Damascus. Everybody follow that, because this is where now it begins to get confusing.
Can I add
Yeah.
something?
Sure.
My daughter Alice just went to Egypt for a little vacation. They flew Qatar Airlines, and when they flew over Israel, on the GPS, it said Palestinian lands.
Yes.
It did not say Israel.
Right.
She was shocked.
Qatar is one of the Gulf states that has not yet established relations with Israel.
Right.
The big thing during the World Cup was that they would allow Israelis to come, but don't be annoying, don't do anything crazy, but you can come and then you must leave again after the World Cup. Now, other Gulf states have now recognized Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and a couple of others, as well as Morocco, have recognized the state of Israel. And I think the Sudan is just about ready to recognize the state of Israel. But I'll get to that in just a second. So, there are the Crusades. There's the rise of Islam, and all this stuff happens. And during all this time, the Jews remain in the land. They do well underneath Islam. They don't do as well in the Crusades, but they survive. You have the development of the Ottoman Empire when finally Constantinople falls to Mehmet. And underneath the Ottomans, you have stability for about 600 years, where the region is basically part and parcel of the Ottoman Empire. It's governed from Damascus. There's really still not a sense of the Palestinian people yet. That doesn't really occur until the 19th century, late 19th century. But you're beginning to see as like the people settle and it becomes less of a nomadic sort of existence for people, and people begin to settle in the area, that there does become more of a sort of the proto-Palestinian people develop. Now, the Ottoman Empire, if anybody's ever heard, the weak sister of Europe, that's the Ottoman Empire. By the time the 19th century rolls around, the Ottoman Empire is pretty weak. It's ripe for the pickings, much the same way that the British kind of move into Egypt in the 18th, 19th century. And really, while Egypt is considered part of the Ottoman Empire, as well as also sort of a semi-autonomous region of the Ottoman Empire, the British really are calling the shots. The ability of the Ottoman Empire to kind of enforce any sort of agreements or understandings in the region that they call Palestine was basically null and void. They just didn't have the ability to kind of administer and provide security. So that's the status of the land when we enter into the 19th century. What we have in the 19th century Europe is a rise in nationalism. We have the beginning of the unification of Germany. You have the beginning of the unification of Italy. You have the development of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so within all this, the Jews have suffered tremendously, those who have lived in Europe. They had hoped with the rise of nationalism that Jews would be seen as, if you were Jewish and living in Germany, you would be seen as German. If you were Jewish living in France, you'd be seen as French, et cetera, et cetera. So the Jews of Europe were very excited about the idea of nationalism and the development of nation state in a modern sense. They found out once it was established that they were still no longer considered as German. You can reside in Germany, but you weren't German, you were still Jewish. And this is well before World War II. This is not an advent of World War II. And so there begins to be an understanding of, we as the Jews, as Israel, we need to be thinking about our own nationalism. And so we have the beginning of what we now call Zionism. It's the idea that the Jewish people are one and that they need a place where they can be Jews, where they can find a place where they can be one with the land, where they're not seen as outsiders, as fifth columns, as people who are manipulating markets, etc. And so there begins underneath Theodore Herzl, particularly after the famous Dreyfus affair in France, which is a French officer, Alfred Dreyfus, who's Jewish, is accused of treason. They were trumped up charges that later proved to be false. But because of the Dreyfus affair, people like Theodor Herzl decide that Jews will never be truly safe in Europe. And so they begin advocating for themselves as Zionists. You have the formation of the World Zionist Congress and other sort of universal gatherings where Jews begin to gather and think about their own state. So that's on one side. That's the political side. Okay. On the other side is just the grassroots side of people saying we're never going to be safe, particularly those who lived in the Pale. The Pale is a region of Ukraine and Russia where Jews were forced to live primarily by the Russian Empire. And frequently people were victims of pogroms where their businesses are destroyed. People are murdered. Unfortunately, you know all too well what all that means. And so from the grassroots, there's some people who are called the lovers of Zion who decides it's time for us to go back to the land. We just want to go back to the land. We'll work the land. We don't care what it's called. We could care less, but we just want to be one with the land. And so this group begins the first sort of immigration back from Europe to what we call present day Israel. But again, they weren't interested in forming a state. That was not their interest. Their interest was just to be in the land. So they come, they create new settlements, they reconnect with some of the other Jews in the land, and they just settle there. You know, this is during the Ottoman Empire. Now the political movement, the other side with Herzl and others, are seeing this immigration, but they also want to make sure that there's a land. And so they enter into negotiations with all of the powers that be. And the powers that be at the time were primarily the British and the French. And when you think about international law is whatever one nation can get other nations to agree to. Okay? And when two powers decide to make a decision, whether it's right or wrong, that's international law. It's really simple. It's power makes right. And that's how our world has been governed, and to an extent is the same today. So the first agreement is a byproduct of the First World War. The Ottoman Empire sides with the Kaiser and fights on the side of the Kaiser and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottomans picked poorly. What ends up happening is the French and the British decide that region, because of the emergence of oil, ships were no longer coal-burning ships. Ships were now oil-burning ships. So there's a need for oil. There's a need to protect the eventual development and further creation of the Suez Canal. The Brits and the French both are thinking of pipelines, which people are still doing, that would bring oil from the lands of like Iraq to the coast. And so the Sykes-Picot Agreement is reached where France would basically get a sphere of influence that would cover what we know as modern-day Syria and Lebanon. In terms of the Christians who lived in the region, there was a group called the Melkites who are still in existence. And the French adopt them as, we're going to support these Christians.
What were they called again?
The Melkites.
Melkites?
Yep. The British, on the other hand, get what we would refer to as Jordan and Israel. Okay, and that's going to be their sphere of influence. They already have holdings in what we call modern day Iraq, and influence in Iran, and obviously they have, they control India, so they have an interest in that whole region. The British do. So now that these two powers have sort of carved up that region for their own purposes, Herzl and Chaim Weizsäll, who will be Herzl's replacement, they start talking about, okay, we really want to be able to return to our land. These are the European Jews. Again, there's still Jews residing in the land. And so we get what is known as the Balfour Declaration, which is passed right towards the end of World War I, which basically says that the British Empire will support efforts of the Jewish people to create a state in the region of Palestine. To this day, the Palestinians believe that this was the most corrupt thing that could ever possibly happen. It's pretty normal on the basis of when it happened in the times. There's nothing illegal about it in the sense that the Brits had the power, they had the ability to make this decision. You can argue that it was a wrong decision, but it was a decision that was justified at the time. This Balfour Declaration gives enough impetus for the increasing flow of Jews immigrating into the land of Palestine. And this is when we begin to see the conflict between the people of the Ottoman Empire who have been in this region for a while and have sort of are beginning to develop their own sense of identity and nationalism. So much the same way that there were nationalist movements in Europe, there were national movements taking place in the region of Palestine. And the Palestinians had created their own press. They had their own native authors and poets who began talking about what it is to be Palestinian. And so you have this emergence of two people with two self-identities in the land that are now going to compete for the land. Obviously, since the vast majority of the people living in the land by the time of post-World War I were Palestinian, they thought that their claim was the most valuable, and they would fight tooth and nail from allowing further Jews to move into the land. The smarter leaders of the Palestinian community understood what was happening and tried to stop it. Other leaders were trying to kind of manipulate to ensure that their tribe, their family got favored status under the Brits or other powers. And so there really wasn't a unified response to the immigration of the Jews into the land. Now, mind you, the Jews frequently were buying land from rich absentee landlords who owned the land of Palestine. And so they thought that they were legally, the Jews that way, were legally acquiring this land. What happened was that Palestinians who were working the land for these absentee landlords were now being kicked off the land that they had worked for generations. But the Jews purchased that land and wanted to use it for Jewish reasons. They wanted to settle on that land. They wanted to bring other Jews to settle on that land. So the conflict gets very real very quickly. The tensions lead to civil wars, revolts. There's an Arab revolt that turns bloody. There's a British response to that revolt that is pretty bloody. There's continual armed skirmishes between Jewish settlers and Palestinians. There's so much turmoil that before World War II even begins, the Brits decide that, we need to try and fix this. So the Peel Commission is created. The Peel Commission comes to the conclusion that the Brits really need to put a halt to the Jewish immigration into the land. And they begin to do that. The Jews don't take kindly to that and completely ignore it and do all sorts of things to illegally bring more Jews to the land. The Palestinians, are obviously irate that they think that the Brits are turning a blind eye to the Jewish efforts to continue the immigration. So again, it's still not a good situation. Now, under the Peel Commission, there is a partition of the land that is offered. The Jewish policy, because they're very much realpolitik, they will take any land at any time. So anytime a partition comes up, the Jews always agree to it. They're smart enough to know that let's get the land. If we need to take more of it, we will. Palestinians, on the other hand, will not ever agree to any kind of partition. It's their land. They should get it all. We will not negotiate. And that's really their overwhelming position that takes place from post-World War I all the way through to post-World War II. There are several partitions of the land that are recommended. The Jews always accept one. Palestinians always refuse. You may argue from the Palestinian perspective that at a point in time they had to realize that there was going to be some form of Jewish state that was going to be created, and they needed to just cut their losses as soon as they could. Hindsight being 2020, it's easy to say that when they're in the midst of it. Why in the world should they negotiate? This is their land.
Can I ask, during these latter times, were there any leaders, quote unquote, for both sides, or were the Jews more cohesive?
The Jews were always far more cohesive.
Okay.
So they had, by the time we get to like the Peel Commission and then following commissions and following movements, they had already created what they called the Jewish Authority.
Okay.
The Jewish Authority was basically it wasn't a shadow government because there was nothing secret about it, but it was a sub-government that was basically, they were setting up with the understanding of at a point in time, our state will come and we want to be ready for it.
Okay.
They had leaders, they had leader councils. Ben-Gurion is one of the most prominent leaders and becomes the first leader of the independent state of Israel. So they were always more organized because they were kind of smaller, but they also were more laser-like focused.
Okay.
Palestinians, on the other hand, they had the numbers, but they never had the organization, and they never had a leader who could unify.
Okay.
You had rivaling families who had different agendas, some that were based in Damascus, some that were based in Jerusalem. They could never really cohere behind a good, sound kind of agenda and policy. And the Jews used that to their advantage.
Okay.
And again, the one thing I want you all to understand is that the Palestinian people, the people themselves, are the ones who get screwed over and over and over again.
Mhm.
They get screwed by the Jewish community, they get screwed by the international community, and they get screwed by their own leaders. Okay? And so it's one of the reasons why, like, if you talk about the Palestinian on the street, they don't know who to trust. To this day, it's one of the biggest issues that's facing Palestinians. Like, who's not going to negotiate for us? Because we're still split. We still don't have leadership. So even if we wanted to have a peace process, well, who do we trust to be our representative in that peace process? It's not Abbas. He's corrupt.
Mhm.
It's not Hamas. They're crazy.
Mhm.
So they're stuck in a double bind. And it's been like that from almost the very beginning.
Mhm.
So eventually what happens is that the British realize that the only thing that unifies Palestinians and Jews is their hatred for the Brits.
Okay.
You have the famous bombing of the King David Hotel,
Mhm.
where the extremist Jewish group, the Irgun, bombed the hotel. Now, the leader of the Irgun at this time was Menachem Begin, who will eventually become the prime minister of Israel. Why did they bomb the King David Hotel? Because that was the British headquarters. At the same time, the Palestinians would ambush the British soldiers as well. So by the time World War II ends, the Brits were like, we've had it. Now, before World War II, what we call the Palestinian Mandate was created. And it's created underneath the auspices of the League of Nations, which was Woodrow Wilson's grand idea, the forecursor of the UN. that the 14 greatest democracies can govern the world and bring peace. It didn't work out too well, but that was the theory. Underneath the League of Nations, the UK, the British Empire, is given what's called the mandate. And their goal is to kind of govern this land, develop it, and create what they hope will be an Israeli or a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. They're not able to get anywhere. And so they finally throw their hands up. And in the meantime, the UN sort of takes it over. And there's a critical time between the time that the Brits hand it over and the UN takes charge that this partition plan of the UN is created. Again, the Jews agree to it. The Palestinians and the Arab nations say, no, we'd rather continue fighting and push the Jews into the sea than accept a partition. The mandate ends. The UN partition plan has been offered. It's approved by everybody but the Palestinians and their Arab allies. The Jews get ready to declare that they are an independent state. The US and many of the other nations say, don't do it. It's just going to lead to a war. The Jews said, we are prepared for this. We just lived through the Holocaust. We're doing this now. We don't necessarily trust anybody else. They declare, the 5 Arab nations declare war on the new state of Israel. The 5 Arab nations are Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt.
Yeah.
It's hard to say how much the hearts of these 5 Arabic nations are in this battle. The Arab Legion, which was the most organized and capable military unit in the Middle East at the time, is led by the British. It's part of the Jordan Empire, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. It's pretty clear that the king has an interest in basically securing the West Bank for Jordan. The Arab Legion moves into the West Bank, doesn't move any further. The Egyptians are able to make it only so far from the east and south. They end up occupying what we would call the Gaza Strip. The Iraqis, who are invading through Syria, don't get much over the Golan before they're stopped cold. So the Syrians and the Iraqis are sort of stopped cold at the Golan. And then the Lebanese really aren't organized whatsoever, so their endeavor in this foray was sort of just lip service. There's a question of if the Arab Legion had continued, what would have happened? We don't know. Many historians just believe that King Abdullah, who was the king of Jordan at the time, just wanted his own land grab, didn't care about the Palestinians, but wanted this pretty fertile region of the Jordan Valley and wanted to be able to control it because it was far more fertile than the land that Jordan had on the other side of the Jordan River. So once again, the Palestinian people who are thinking that these Arab nations are going to come to their defense are sort of left hung out to dry. The Israelis do the unthinkable. They win this battle, and we have the situation where the state of Israel now exists from Haifa on the coast down to Ashdod, down through the Negev to Eilat, which is the port on the Red Sea, then up the Jordan Valley into the hills around Jerusalem, up. They control the land between the West Bank and the coast, then up and through the Galilee. They control everything up to the Sea of Galilee. They do not control the Golan. The Golan stays in the hands of Syria. So that's the outcome of the war. The partition no longer matters, at least not to the Jews, because one, they were the only party that agreed to it. Two, they were attacked and they took the land through war.
Mhm.
And so they viewed it as theirs. And so any attempt like today to try and go back to that original partition plan is insane. It's never going to happen. Don't even bring it up. For the Israelis, there was too much Israeli blood that was spilled that they would ever consider giving back any of that land. What was originally the plan for a unified international city of Jerusalem now is split. The city is split from east and west. The eastern region is controlled by the Jordanians. So the old city is now part of the Jordanian kingdom. The western part of the city now becomes part of Israel. The capital of Israel is Tel Aviv, however, for the time being anyway, because there's still hope that there will be some form of peace agreement. So let me stop there and see if there's any questions.
So, go ahead.
The settlements that the current regime is.
We'll get to that. That's post 67. I mean, it's confusing because we'll talk about settlements before, but those are just sort of like the establishment of like kibbutzes, etc. And then when we talk about the settlements that you're talking about is a post 67 phenomena.
Mhm.
And I'll talk about that directly when we look at the post 67 dynamic.
So to me, the whole Palestinian issue is that they have continued to follow what seems to be the Arabian style of tribal, of a tribal, I don't know what.
Yeah, it's that is part of the dynamic that has hindered them, and I don't mean like hindered them
Right.
like it's a bad thing. I mean, but it just they're coming up against a westernized understanding of people and government, and things need to be hierarchical in order to govern effectively, in order to control things, and the Jews were set up that way. The Palestinians, having never ever governed anything, were still coming from a perspective of tribes, of sort of reciprocity and cooperation. You would get a group of chieftains together and they would decide what's going to happen. And one, that's fine unless you're in a war. If you're going to fight a war, that's not the best way of fighting the war. And so they were hindered by that. But when I say hindering, I want you to make sure I'm not making any sort of negative comment on them. It's just for the situation that they were in, it wasn't the best. Okay, so we now have the state of Israel. You have the state of Israel that's now attempting to defend its boundaries. You still have hostile states. So an armistice is signed. An armistice is a temporary ceasefire agreement. There's no peace agreement. So basically, they are still in a state of war with those 5 nations. As a matter of fact, 3 of them, they are still underneath a state of war from that time. And those 3 are Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. So what happens is now that you have your borders that they need to protect, they continue to have incursions by a group called the Fedayeen, who are a militant group that are based in the Arab states. Some are based in Syria, some are based in Jordan, some are based in the Gaza Strip, and they frequently cross the border the armistice lines, caused destruction, murder, you name it. So there's really a constant state of war that's at work during this time. It's not like from the founding of the independent state of Israel to 1967, everything's fine. In the 50s, you have these incursions, but then you also have the Suez War, where the Brits and the French manipulate the Israelis into going to war against Egypt because they want, the Brits and the French want to control the Suez Canal.
Mhm.
And they want Nasser out of the way so that they can take over the Suez Canal. So they sort of manipulate the Israeli leadership to enter into this war. The Americans find out about the agreement. They force the Israelis to withdraw, even though at a point in time the Israelis in the Suez conflict had come really close to hitting Cairo, which is a tremendous kind of blow to the Egyptians and Nasser, which only redoubles his efforts to destroy the Jewish state. So Nasser and Syria begin this, what's called as the Pan-Arab movement, where actually Syria and Egypt for a while are unified. He starts making more and more threatening remarks about the state of Israel. You know, we're into the 60s. The state of Israel still is dealing with these incursions. They're very concerned. The language that's being thrown around is basically saying, okay, now that we've rearmed, we have the largest military in the Middle East. This was Egypt. We just fought down in Yemen, actually, a proxy war. Our troops are trained. They're ready. They break the the post-Suez War agreement, and they move their military from the Canal Zone, which they were supposed to not move their military out of. They tell the UN observers to leave. The UN observers do what UN observers do, and they left. And then the Egyptians moved their forces to the border of Israel in the Suez, in the Sinai. The Israelis are convinced that they are going to be invaded. The Americans seem to believe that they're not, and they're telling the Israelis, "You're not going. There's no imminent invasion. There's no imminent invasion." Jews don't buy it. They decide that the best defense is a good offense. 1967, they launched their Air Force and they wipe out the Egyptian and Syrian Air Force in about a few hours. They then commenced land operations. They focused on the Egyptian threat to the south. They break the back of the Egyptian armor in the Sinai and push the Egyptians back to the Suez Canal. They then turn their attention to the north because the Syrians have invaded the Golan. They push the Syrians off the Golan and are on their way to Damascus when, again, the Americans say no. They withdraw, but they've now rapidly enlarged the state of Israel. The state of Israel now comprises the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula.
Mhm.
In addition, in 1967, after the hostilities began, there had been covert conversations between the Israelis and the Jordanians saying, if you stay out of this, we will not bother you. Please do not enter the war. The king of Jordan really wants to listen to the Israelis because he's never been one that really wants to go toe-to-toe. But because the Arab nations are really pressuring him, he decides to enter the war. The Israelis were ready. And the book by Yoshi Klein Halevi now tells that battle where the paratroopers from Israel liberate the old city, the eastern portion, and eventually the Israelis force the Jordanians out of the West Bank. So now, it's 1967, it's post 1967. Again, the Israelis think that it's a miracle that they've once again defeated these powers, because once again, it was a David versus Goliath thing. They now have the historic lands of Israel unified. However, they do not annex any of these regions. They do not say that the West Bank is now Israeli territory, nor do they say the Sinai is now Israeli territory. They govern it, they control it, but they do not annex it. They had a stated policy that said that we will trade land for peace. In other words, they are more than willing to give up the lands that they conquered in 67 if the other people, the other parties, choose peace. Eventually, Begin and Sadat are able to achieve that peace. The Sinai Peninsula goes back to Egypt, and they have a peace deal in 1979. It's the first Arab nation that signs a peace agreement with the State of Israel, the first Arab nation that recognizes the State of Israel, and they exchange ambassadors. But you still have a situation where Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon do not have peace agreements. So then there's the question of, what do you do with the Palestinians in the West Bank? Everybody's aware of the UN resolution saying that Israel is supposed to leave the occupied territory. The Israelis always wonder, okay, what's the occupied territory? Because it doesn't say territories, it just says territory. What does that refer to? So the other part of UN Resolution 242 is also that the parties must recognize each other. So in other words, if Israel is going to give up the occupied regions that they've taken, the other parties have to recognize the State of Israel, which they refuse to do. So it's not like one side, Israel, refused to follow the UN Resolution 242. Both sides refuse to recognize the terms of that resolution. But what Nancy's talked about with the settlements becomes an interesting dilemma. So what happens in 1948, there's a settlement region, and we're going to visit this area. What do they call it? Gush Etzion. There was a Jewish settlement in Gush Etzion in 1948. During the war that erupts, the women and children of this settlement are evacuated, and the men stay behind. When the war breaks out and the Jordanians advance, every single one of the men are slaughtered in Gush Etzion. Among the paratroopers in 1967 who liberate the old city are children of Gush Etzion. And so they decide that they have the right to return to their homeland, the place that they grew up. And so they go, many of the children of the families go and reestablish the settlement in Gush Etzion, which is now in the West Bank. So we have the development of the first settlement. The leaders of Israel were never quite sure what to do. One, they never thought they were going to get this land. Two, how do you respond to the children of families who were slaughtered, who just want to go back to the land where they grew up? It was hard for the Israeli government and the leaders to say no. And so they just didn't do anything. I think they hoped that this would just be a one-off. But then what happens is you have the rise of more religious Zionists who see that now Israel has the whole land of Israel, not just a slice of it, but the whole land of historic Israel. And so the settlement process picks up to the point that we have a situation today where you have several legalized settlements and you have a number of illegal settlements. The Israelis always say when it comes to peace agreements that not all these settlements will remain. And they point to what they had to do in the Sinai when they signed the agreement with Egypt. There were settlements in the Sinai, and these settlements had to be forcibly removed by the Israeli Defense Forces because those settlers weren't going to leave either. So Israel points back to this and says, look, when we have a peace agreement, we will remove the settlers in regions that are not part of the peace agreement. Palestinians don't necessarily believe that. The Israeli says, we've done it before, we'll do it again. But as it states right now, as I've been told, if it has a mall, if the settlement has a mall, it's staying. If a settlement doesn't have a mall, Israel will empty it. So that sort of leads us into the present situation. I mean, we have another war in 73, which is basically a repeat of 67, except this time, it's the War of Yom Kippur, where the 5 Arab nations fire the first shot. They invade on Yom Kippur when every observant Jew is at synagogue. They catch the Israelis with their, pants around their ankles, and they do well until the Israelis can mobilize, get moving. And then once again, they're on the road to Damascus and the road to Cairo, and the Americans have to pull them back. So that leads to the first peace agreement in 1979 between Sadat and Begin. Originally, the Palestinians were supposed to be part of that deal, and then Begin said, look, this is enough for me. I can sell this deal to my people, but if you throw the Palestinian situation into this, I can't get this deal. So if we want peace today between Egypt and Israel, let's just focus here. That argument wins the day. Sadat pulls back the request for a solution to the Palestinian situation. That can is kicked down the road. There are numerous agreements. The PLO kicks up tremendously in the terms of their terrorist activity in the 70s. The airline hijackings, the bombings, etc. Finally, there begins to be a little breakthrough in the 90s. Some low-level agricultural exchanges between Palestinians and Israeli leaders in Norway begins to shape conversations that will lead to what's known as the Oslo Accords. The first important part of the Oslo Accords, even before the major accords are signed, is the fact that the PLO will recognize the existence of the State of Israel, and the State of Israel will recognize the PLO as the rightful voice of the Palestinian people. So the breakthrough is that now both will recognize each other as legal entities. Okay, which is no small feat, because now you have the recognition of the State of Israel, which the State of Israel desperately wanted. Because up until then, most Arab nations just denied its existence, so that when you flew over it, the sign would say Palestinian territories. And from the PLO, from Arafat, because this is Yasser Arafat, Arafat now has the ability to be legally recognized as the leader of the Palestinian people. Okay, so it's pretty major. So they then create a template for how they are going to govern the occupied territories. And they're going to move into the ability for the Palestinians to have some form of self-rule. So Jericho is the first major experiment where Jericho will be governed wholly by the Palestinians. Eventually, you'll see the same thing occurring in the West Bank and Gaza. In the Oslo Accords, you'll have the West Bank broken into 3 regions. These regions are determined by who has military or security control and who has civil control. In one region, the Palestinians will have both security and civil control. And most of the Palestinians in the West Bank live underneath Palestinian security and civil control. These are places like Nablus, Jenin, Ramallah, places like that. In other areas, the Palestinians will have civil control, but the Israelis will have military control. So there's areas around, oh my goodness gracious, what's Hebron, that has Palestinian control, but it's underneath the IDF in terms of security. And then you have regions that are both militarily and civilly controlled by Israel. The understanding that this was just supposed to be a stopgap process, that over a 5-year period, the two sides will continue negotiating on the more difficult things, like what's the final status of Jerusalem going to be, what's water decisions going to be, what's the defense of the Jordan Valley going to be. And so they agreed to the Oslo Accords in 95, and the idea is that by the year 2000, there will be final stage agreements. Camp David under Clinton was 2000, Ehud Barak, Yasser Arafat. They believe they've got a deal, at least Clinton and Barak believe they have a deal. Arafat, we don't know why. Personally, I think he was too scared to govern, this is no shot against him, but I think he was giving up so much of what he has historically said he wanted that he wasn't going to be able to look himself in the face. And so he walks away. He walks away from an agreement where basically what we know as the West Bank or occupied territories, 99.5 or 99.6% was going to be Palestinian. And so it was going to be a state. He walks away from it. We have the outbreak of the Second Intifada, which is a bloody uprising. The peace deals collapse. And that's where we are today. The Oslo Accords are still in governance, so you still have the split governance. You still have regions like Nablus and Jenin and Ramallah that are still underneath Palestinian control, both security and civil. But the control of the Palestinian Authority is very thin. You have armed groups within the Palestinian community that are constantly fighting with the Palestinian security forces. The Palestinians nominally control Nablus and Jenin. Other factions, such as the Den of Lions, which is a recent group that is really taken over Nablus, are in existence. The recent action by the IDF to go into Jenin was to eliminate some of these armed groups that are rising up against the Palestinian Authority and who are also conducting terrorist activities in Israel proper. Since the Palestinian Authority has not been able to secure these individuals and arrest them, the IDF decided to do it themselves, which led to the raid where 9 Palestinians were killed, including a grandmother and a child, I believe. The response to that raid was the attack on the synagogue, where 7 Jews were killed. That's where we're at. Questions? There will be a quiz tomorrow. Multiple choice mostly. So the answer will be in front of you.
And it'll be multiple choice, right? All of the above.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that a friend of mine who went to Israel recommended that the ladies carry a scarf with them, just in case when you go into the religious places, they want our heads covered. So I just wanted to get that FYI to the group.
Okay.
That's not the case. That's not the case for the churches.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we do end up visiting a religious Muslim situation, yes, but it's not required for the churches that we'll be visiting.
Will we be visiting a Muslim place?
I'm not sure yet. We're still trying to finalize some stuff.
Okay.
I covered a lot in a very short period of time. There's a lot that I left out, but out of fear that I might lose you all and have several cancellations to the trip, I decided not to do that. You can feel free to kind of listen to this as you go to bed and help you fall asleep. I do want to. What time is it? Okay. If you don't have any more questions, I do want to talk to you a little bit about kind of how the church has viewed the land. Is everybody up to that? That's about 20 minutes.
Yep.
Sure.
Casey's nodding yes, so I'm just going to go off his cue.
He's-
All right, man.
Yes.
Is he
Right.
here? Is he? Let me
Yeah,
see.
he's here.
Hey, hi. I didn't realize.
He even looks awake and everything.
Wow. Hi, Case.
Hello.
Okay.
All right, let me.
Pastor,
Yeah.
Jake Tapper had an interview with Bibi, and a lot of the end stuff that you spoke about with the who's civil versus security. He talked about it last week.
Yeah, Bibi called me before he went on to make sure he was getting
Yeah,
the story straight.
You said what he said. Yes, I just wanted
Uh-huh.
to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, let me.
Okay. When you refer to the church, Todd, are you speaking Catholic Church?
No.
What kind of
You know,
church?
I love how you just assume that
Yes.
Catholics run everything.
That's right.
No, unbelievable.
Yeah, we did, we
All right,
started
so
with the
no,
Crusades. And,
so everybody, when I say the church, it's everybody. Like we're all descendants of that same church.
okay.
Okay. I as a Presbyterian have as much claim upon the church prior to the Reformation as a Roman Catholic.
Okay.
Because that's my history too. Our theologians, we have same theologians. So when I say the church or Christians, I'm meaning the universal, the whole thing.
Okay.
So this was a presentation I gave to another group that was going on a trip to Israel, and they wanted to know sort of how the church viewed Israel and what was its relationship. So obviously, the earliest followers of Christ were Jews residing in Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean. These early Christians held very similar views as other Jews. Justin the Martyr was the first Christian to actually refer to the land as holy. And this was in his dialogue with Trypho, in which he creates this conversation between a Christian and a Jew. And so if you're in Israel and you refer to it as the Holy Land, you will get views from Israelis looking at you funny. They never refer to the land as the Holy Land.
Okay.
The only people who refer to Israel as the Holy Land are Christians. Okay. So, we know about the destruction of the temple in 70 as well as then in 135. And what does that mean about the future of the land? Or how do Christians view it? For the most part, some of our early church leaders settle in the region of Caesarea, which again is the Roman city on the coast. It's the first stop we will make on our trip. You will get off the plane, bouncing up and down. You will be so energized. We will collect all of our goodies. We will get on the bus. You will sit on the bus and probably fall asleep. And then an hour later, we will be in Caesarea. But this was an international city where some of the early Christians who wanted to reside in the quote unquote Holy Land moved to and have their base of operation. So the restoration of Israel was the prominent belief that Christ's return would usher in the reign of God on earth. Okay. That was common to what the Jews thought, that the Messiah would come back to the land. There would be the restoration. Israel would be recreated, and the kingdom would come. Most early Christians would be considered chiliast, which simply means a belief in a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. That would occur before the coming of the kingdom. Origen, one of the early church leaders or thinkers, begins to develop a spiritualization of the land. He believed that since Jesus did not exactly follow the path laid out in prophetic texts, that these texts cannot be read literally, and so the land loses some of its influence. It's not as important. When Jesus says things like, "My kingdom is not of this world," people like Origen said that the land is no longer important. At the same time, you have a reemergence of the Jewish community in the land, that follows the Bar Kokhba revolt. Jews were now returning in growing numbers to Judea since they eventually will have protected status in the empire. And that comes about with Constantine as well. As I mentioned, Caesarea, not Jerusalem, was to become the first Christian center in the region. With the ascension of Constantine as emperor, you have the safety of pilgrimages that can take place from people in the West journeying east. You have a rebuilding of Jerusalem. The first such building made is the Church of the Anastasis, which eventually will be merged with another church that we now call the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which we will visit. The first great marketer in the history of the world, Constantine's mother, Helen, turns the Holy Land into a money-making endeavor. Almost every religious site that we will visit in Jerusalem was discovered by Helen. Supposedly, she found the cross. And to this day, you can still find people who will sell you a piece of the cross. That cross must be the size of, the Grand Canyon, in order to have all these pieces fit together by now. It's her exploration that leads us to believe that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the place of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. And when you think about it, it's as good of a story as anybody else. In other words, I'm not going to say without doubt that this is the site. At the same time, I don't have any reason not to believe it. And there are some interesting things when we're in the church that you will see that will definitely make you question, Greek culture also has an influence on visiting sites because the Greeks always have their different sites. This is where Delphi is. This is where the Oracle was. This is where. So the early Christians sort of feed on that. And there's special sort of like holy places that they create. You can think about tours and other places that will develop, and pilgrimage becomes very important. So if you were to craft a map of what the world looks like, if God creates the world and Jerusalem is the seat of God's temple, then Jerusalem must be the center of the world. Okay? Jerusalem is that which connects Asia, Europe, and Africa. This is a very early worldview of the early church. Now you notice that here you have America, right? So this map was created after the discovery of America, but this is sort of how the church views Jerusalem in the world. So like the earth must be the center of the universe, Jerusalem must be center of the earth. Okay, so that would be how the church views it, and if they were to draw a map, that's what it might look like. I love how they got England up here.
Isn't that where Helen is from?
Huh?
England?
Yeah, Helen was.
You know better than I do where she's from. I don't know where she's from. What do I care about Helen? It's a Greek name. So by the 7th century, you have the coming of Islam, which did not end Christianity in the region. The one thing that Christians and Jews were not able to do underneath Islam is they couldn't proselytize, but they were allowed to exist, and both thrived. There was a relationship between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Caliph, which meant that holy sites remained, and people could still visit. Even though the region was controlled by Muslims, it still meant that there could be trade going back and forth. And during this period, it was the Eastern Rite churches, which I would say are the Orthodox, that were ascendant. And even to this day, the Greek Orthodox Church is the largest church in the region and the largest landowner in the state of Israel. The Knesset, upon which the Israeli parliament is based, is on land that was leased from the Greek Orthodox Church.
Okay.
So eventually, both for religious reasons as well as a desire of the Pope to sort of get the warring groups out of Europe and send them somewhere else, Pope Urban calls for a crusade to liberate the lands of Jesus. So in the 11th century, we have the Crusades taking place. The First Crusade is by far the most successful. After that, we have less and less of influence done by the Crusades. We have the formation of what we call the Crusader states. Okay, it wasn't just one big kingdom of Jerusalem is created. You have a state of Edessa, which legend has it, Edessa is the king there accepted the Christian faith and becomes the first king and the first people to become Christian. This is in northern Syria, southern Turkey. You have the Principality of Antioch. You then have the Principality of Tripoli, and then the Kingdom of Jordan, which includes Acre, where there's a Crusader temple that their remains still there. You would have it from kind of Haifa down Acre down to the Sinai. So sort of the classic understandings of Israel were in this region. And they're all governed differently. So this is sort of what Jerusalem looks like. Now, the walls that we see in Jerusalem when we're there are walls that were created by the Ottomans. So when you see those walls, do not go, oh, wow, those are pretty hardy walls that David and Solomon must have built. No, the Turks built them. The Ottomans built them. And you can see some of the ancient walls underneath them, but the walls that we see will be the Ottoman walls. This is a picture of those Ottoman walls. As you're looking from a very similar viewpoint that we will scan when we depart Jerusalem. It's called the Haz Promenade. You can see this is the Dome of the Rock. Okay, and you have what we would call as the Noble Sanctuary here. This is probably an image of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the infamous Messiah Gate, which is bricked up because the Muslims thought that if they bricked it up, the Messiah could not enter the city. I believe this is an image of the Lion's Gate, which is where even today most of the Palestinians or Muslims will enter into to go to the Noble Sanctuary for Friday prayers.
Will we visit there?
Where?
The Dome of the Rock.
We will probably not visit because I think we're planned to be in Jerusalem on Friday.
Oh.
And I have entered the Lion Gate on a Friday. It's a madhouse. And to be honest with you, given where heightened tensions are right now, Friday afternoons when the young men go to the Al-Aqsa, because the Dome of the Rock is not a worship site, the Friday prayers will occur at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the Noble Sanctuary. There's you can go to an archaeological area where we believe was the old entrance to the temple. And if you were to say, if there's one area that we know Jesus walked on, it was on those steps, because that's how you would get into the temple. It's really not a good idea to go to that area because it's just below the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And when some of the young men get riled up, they throw stones.
Yeah.
But yes, we will visit the old city on Friday. We will do the walking tour. You will, I think we're also going to do an evening rooftop walk, which is really interesting. And you'll see the four quarters. There's the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, the Muslim corner, and what's the other quarter? There's four.
Catholic.
I've named three. No. Catholics don't get a corner. The Armenian quarter.
Right. Okay.
How could any of you have missed that? Unbelievable. Chris, I don't know what we're going to do with these people.
Mm-hmm.
Have a great time.
If we're traveling and you can't ask me a question, feel free to ask Chris. Chris, how many trips have you been on?
This might make 5 or 6.
Wow.
So Chris and I have been on, this will be our third together?
Yes.
Okay. And hopefully we'll still be allowed in when we get to the passport control. So pre-state, so before the state of Israel gets announced, the predominant churches in the region are the Latin Rites, Catholic, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Orthodox, and the Melkite. So I mentioned the Melkite group before. Melkite means king. And so this is a church that is sort of Syriac. It's recognized as one of the great churches. It worships with the understanding that Christ is king, but it does not fall underneath the sphere of like the other influences. Those of you who have read Blood Brothers by Elias Shakur, he is a Melkite priest. The Melkites are numerous in Lebanon as well as Israel, but they're more numerous in Lebanon. And well, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how many survived in Syria. They might all be dead, unfortunately. And again, the Greek Orthodox is the largest and still the most influential.
Are there no Coptic Christians at all, or?
No, they're in Egypt.
Okay.
The Coptics are, if you are an Egyptian Christian, 99%, there's a 99% chance that you're Coptic. There are very few other Christian churches in Egypt.
Okay.
The primary role of these denominations pre-state status was the protection of the holy sites. You'll get a flavor for it on the journey. If there's a Catholic site, there's going to be a corresponding Greek Orthodox site. So when we visit the Church of the Annunciation, there's a Catholic church there, and then 4 blocks away is the Greek Orthodox Church. And one of them is supposedly the site of the Annunciation. You can pick and choose. The Catholic Church is far more impressive as a building, so most people go to it.
Okay.
But it's like that. It's like that everywhere. Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Ethiopia. You have the rooftop where the
Oh yes.
Christians are.
Yes. On the way into Holy Sepulchre.
Yes. It's
Yeah.
on the roof.
Yeah. Yep. And hopefully we'll experience that. As I mentioned earlier, with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, particularly just leading up to World War I and right after it, the European powers begin to have larger influence over the region. Just before World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm visits the Holy Land. And from that point forward, the Germans will have a sizable role, and the Lutheran Church develops in the land. Us Presbyterians were never cool enough to really found any congregations there. We were far more into the schools and hospitals situation. There are no worshiping Presbyterians. There are 2 Church of Scotland churches, one in Jerusalem and one in Tiberias. Neither is really anything special, and the communities are very small. The communities worshiping there are mostly expats, business people, tourists. As I mentioned, with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, other groups enter in. England, with the Mandate, ushers in the Anglican Church. So you have we're going to visit St. George's. St. George is the Anglican Church in Jerusalem. It's the seat of the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, which serves both churches in Jordan, West Bank, and Israel. For the most part, until 1967, all of these churches, particularly European churches, were ruled from afar. There are no indigenous leaders. Post-1967, we see more Palestinians in particular who are Palestinian Christian, who are moving into leadership roles. And to today, almost all of them, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, or the Anglicans, even the Greek Orthodox. I'm not sure what the Latin rites are today, but those three major ones are all led by indigenous leaders. They're Palestinians. We still, as Presbyterians, we still have a difficult time understanding the land and its importance to the Jewish people. We still err on the side of spiritualizing the land too much. While we talk that the land is important to the Jewish people, we sort of stop short in saying that there is a necessary connection between the two, which the Jewish people believe wholeheartedly, that there's a direct connection between the land and the people. I don't think there's anything more in there. I think that's it.
Okay.
Todd, did you make
Again-
mention of the Mormons?
Oh, for God's sakes, do I have to?
Look, I was surprised. I didn't know they had a whole situation there.
So the Mormons, just outside the old city, on the West Bank side of the old city, purchased a huge plot of land that they are developing into, I don't know if they're going to put a temple there, but they're turning it into a school and other things.
Okay.
The Mormons, in Israel, you're not allowed to proselytize. So I don't know how the Mormons are going to make a go of being in Israel.
Okay.
Like most of the churches that are in existence are basically able to maintain themselves through family. But you're not allowed to go out and proselytize. It's against the law in Israel. So the good thing is you won't see any street preachers. If they annoy you, you won't see any of them.
Don't see witnesses.
What's that, Nancy?
Jehovah's Witnesses. None of them.
Yeah, you won't run into them.
No Hare Krishna.
I don't think so. You may see them in the airport.
Okay.
But no, so the Mormons have this huge complex and have land that they're going to develop. We're not quite sure what it's going to look like, but they have this huge plot of land that they bought. If they have the audacity, just in thinking of geopolitically, if they have the audacity of putting a temple there, I would like to talk to their leadership about like political do's and don'ts. Not a good idea. There's only one temple in Israel. Keep it that way, otherwise bad things might happen to you. And I say that jokingly, but also realistically. Some of the more ultra right-wing people still believe that until they blow up the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, God will not return to the temple.
Wow. Okay.
So, yeah. Anything else I left out, Chris?
I will save it for the trip. Talk about the Hebrew Israelites who are
Yeah.
also there.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah.
Scott, Todd, what draws you back time after time to Israel?
I get to drink with Chris.
Besides that?
Oh. When you're in the Galilee, I think you'll understand.
Okay.
You mean the area of the Galilee?
Yeah.
Not the water, just the area?
No, it could be the water. But no, when you're in the region of the Galilee, there is something special. Not so much for me, Jerusalem. I know for my friends, like Jerusalem is huge. I'm not a big fan of Jerusalem. From a historical side of things, it's fascinating, but like religiously, I don't get much out of Jerusalem, but the Galilee, that's amazing.
Are you going to point that out to us? Or something that we
Well,
just get?
Well, hopefully you'll experience it.
Okay.
But there's something, you sort of get out of the bus at different sites and you just look around and you might see Jesus walking around. I mean, it really is, and I'm not saying like you see like an astral image. I mean, I'm just saying you could feel like you were in that place in that time.
Okay. That's the pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course, the food's really good too, and there's plenty of it.
Very true.
And
The other thing that's interesting about it is every time I go back, they're uncovering new sites every single time. Like the landscape is different every single time because you're walking on centuries and centuries of history that they will never uncover it all. So it's not the same place when you go back the second time.
right. And you'll always miss something. Like it doesn't matter, and it could just be because you're tired because it was a long day and you don't take like a full glimpse of one place. And the next time you go, you're better, and so you check it out. And you're like, oh wow, I can't believe I missed that last time. There is something that you uncover each time, and the people that we meet with and we're going to talk with are really amazing people.
Okay.
I mean, they're doing amazing work in a very difficult situation. Hopefully, while we're in Jerusalem, so we're going to meet with folks at Gladwyne Viva International School, students and staff, which, Jews and Palestinians. And then we're going to have 2 of the youth join us on Friday and Saturday. One, they'll be with our, the 2 young people who are coming with us, but also it'll give you a little different perspective.
Right.
And then, we'll hear from Mohammed Darwash on Friday morning. He'll be able to shed his light on the present political situation. That evening, we'll hear from the PCUSA mission coordinator, Doug Dix, who I disagree with on just about everything related to Israel, but it's important to hear what the denomination is doing. We'll hear from him. Saturday, we're going to be doing kind of Masada in the Dead Sea. Sunday, we'll be worshiping. Hopefully we'll meet with Archbishop Nahum, the Anglican bishop for the Holy Land. We'll meet with representatives of Kids for Peace. And then that evening, we're going to meet with Rabbi Eugene Korn, who used to be the academic director at the Institute for Christian and Jewish Dialogue, who's going to talk about that work and the realities of the Christian community in Israel and Palestine. Monday, we'll meet with Roots, which is a wonderful community of Palestinians living with settlers and dialoguing and discussing. And we're just going to hear some interesting stuff. Oh, plus we'll be in Bethlehem. We're going to meet with Evangelical, a Baptist Christian in Bethlehem. He has the largest worshiping community, I believe, in Israel, Palestine. So we'll have his perspective of what it is to be an evangelical Christian. So the people that we talk to and meet with, I think are going to, they're going to knock your socks off, and really kind of appreciate the work that they do in a very difficult context.
Okay. Okay.
Any other questions?
No.
Any questions about the trip in general?
Practical
Like,
question.
Yeah.
Are you allowed to pack, like, not in your take on board luggage, but the stuff you're shipping through? Can you pack like coffee or something, if there's something in particular that you really feel you can't live without? Are you allowed to put any type of food into your luggage?
In terms of check bags?
Yes.
I think so.
Okay.
I have one question. Do they need COVID testing to enter Israel?
No.
Okay, good. Thanks.
No, I mean, and we're monitoring that. Our tour operator is monitoring that. So if that changes, we'll know as soon as possible.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else?
Time are we leaving?
I'm not sure if I missed. Is someone talking?
Oh,
Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Nancy.
I said, what time are we leaving? On Monday?
If you don't read your emails, you'll never know.
I didn't read by emails today. There's anything.
Well, I sent it a week ago.
I think I got it, but remind.
Be at church by 11:15 because we are going to leave at 11:30 sharp.
Oh, okay. 11:30 Monday.
No, we leave at 11:30. You're there at 11:15.
Right.
All right. I'm not waiting. You ain't there. We're leaving. I'll sell those tickets to some nice Hasidic family.
Okay.
All right. What was your question, Margaret?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I missed it. On that we are getting there, leaving Monday. We are arriving on Tuesday, but I didn't see the places that we will be visiting on that Tuesday. I know we had to be there by 11:30, and I did not see it on that list.
Yeah. So Tuesday is a pretty light day. Okay. We're recognizing that travel is going to be tiring, even if you sleep well on a plane. So the only major thing we're doing on Tuesday once we land is one is getting something to eat. But then two is driving up to Caesarea. Caesarea is right on the coast. It's an ancient Roman ruin. There's an amphitheater there. There's you can see the port. There's some small shopping that you can do there. So that's really the big event for the day, because once we leave Caesarea, we're then driving inland to the Galilee, and we'll drive to Nov-Kinizar, where we will be staying for 2 days. So Tuesday is a pretty light day.
Okay. And were you able to make contact with
I'm working on it.
Okay,
I'll let you know this week. I need to just get some
Wonderful.
particulars about it. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
No, not for me.
All right. If anything pops up, don't hesitate to email me. Oh, if you have not sent me your cell phones, please do. So I have your numbers, and please download WhatsApp if you haven't already, because we're going to use WhatsApp to communicate. It's also a great way of sharing, if you have photos that you want to share with the group, or if we have a day where people are able to scatter and we want to collect people, we want to make sure that we can stay in touch with folks on a chat. So that's going to be a necessity. So please, hopefully everybody has smartphones and can do the WhatsApp thing. If not, then we'll just tether you with a cord of some sort.
Okay.
All right. Anything comes up, let me know. Looking forward to it.
All right,
Super.
good night.
That was super,
Thank
Todd.
you. Good night.
Good night.